Hello everyone. This is Friday evening in Dayton, Ohio. I'm in my office. Before I leave my office to go home, I decided to make this video and talk to you a little bit about our practice teaching assignment. I stopped grading your assignments 2 days ago. I've been watching your videos. I've been reading your lesson plans. I got back to you and gave you individual feedback. But I think it's a good idea to bring together our kind of collective experience in a video, which could be a good chance for me to talk about lesson planning. Because at this point, when we got to this exercise, I realized that we haven't been really focusing on lesson planning. So we have talked about different theories, but we haven't had a lot of chance, considering the constraints of the program and the module, to translate those theories into lesson plans, and this has been our first chance. So because we've done that now, so I thought that it would be helpful to focus a little bit more on lesson planning at this point, particularly because you're going to do your second lesson very soon, in a few days. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my vision of lesson planning with you, and I'm going to bring in examples of what you shared with me to show that there is a lot of harmony between the way you have been approaching your practicums and the way I see lesson planning. But I think there are areas for improvement, and based on that particular need for improvement, I've put together this presentation. So the very basic idea of a lesson plan, when I read your lesson plans, the first thing that I really think about is there a logical kind of development in the body of your lesson plan. I typically look at lesson plans as a piece written for theatrical performance. So I really want, in my own lesson plans, I really want to see a very strong opening, then good development of the topic or of the goal of learning, and eventually a very strong conclusion, which for me is usually how my students have enriched the language use using the lesson that I gave the students. We had a lot of examples of really creating good flows in lesson plans. Let me show you one example here. So if you look at Elsie's lesson plan, she's focusing in this lesson on adverbs. So what she does is, in a very logical way, she starts defining what adverbs are. Then she invites the students to find words and adverbs in the texts she provides the students with, and eventually she invites the students to use the adverbs in their own language. So there is a clear goal. There is preparation to demonstrate the goal of the lesson. Students engage with text to find examples of the lesson, or of the focus of the lesson, which is adverbs here, and eventually students produce adverbs in their own texts. So I think this is pretty much what I mean by a logical flow. The way I simplify this flow for myself, which I'm more than happy to share with you, some of you might like this approach, some of you may not, but I'm delighted to share that with you anyway, is, let me share my screen with you here. Is this simple chart. So the most important thing in my lesson for me is really the goal. You had clear goals. There are very few exceptions when the goals were not really very clear or narrowed down. So, but generally speaking, I think all the students in this module have a clear kind of vision of what they wanted to teach. I just wanted to highlight one point when you're thinking about creating the goals for your lessons. A lot of times teachers, when they're thinking about the goal of the lesson, I think it's very convenient to think about, for instance, a grammatical concept. That I walk into the classroom today and I teach the present perfect. I personally, I can see the logic of this, but I personally feel, probably because of my background, which is, I think, in my background as an ESL teacher, I'm really interested in communicative events, in events that human beings socially partake in. So for me, the goal of a lesson does include grammar, vocabulary, and the rest of the list. However, the main goal of each lesson for me is a communicative situation, is a social situation in which we need particular grammatical constructs and a particular set of words to be able to address that issue. So let me go back to the present perfect example. So I never walk into the classroom thinking that I want to teach the present perfect today. I might think that present perfect would be one component of my lesson. But the goal of my present perfect lesson is, for instance, learning from the unique experiences of my students. So I encourage them to use the present perfect when talking about the unique experiences. For instance, have you ever been to Africa? Have you ever been to Mexico? So for me, the goal is really a kind of conceptual, communicative, social, cultural concept. And the grammar, vocabulary, writing rhetoric, everything else goes beneath that communicative goal. The big the big advantage of having this approach is that helps you later on engage the students because they're already attached to the topic, because they see a kind of meaningful concept they have to deal with. And because you have already created a communicative context, the students can engage with the material in the tasks and activities that you have designed. So let me show you some examples of what our students did this time. I think a fantastic goal in the lesson plans I read this week was, there were a lot of great examples. The example that I remembered very well was Eda's example of his lesson. Just listen to his goal of the lesson. Let me just share my screen with you again and find Eda's video. Eda's video is here. Right at the beginning, he explains what the goal of the lesson is.
This is what I want you to do today. This is the objective, okay? You're going to talk about environmental problems. I know you have seen this in English too. And you're going to give your opinion on how to solve some of the problems. And I know you remember this beautiful thing right here, the puzzle, correct? Yes. Okay, so.
Okay. So, this is the way. Let me come back to the camera. So, Eda very clearly says that the objective of the lesson is environmental issues. If you had read his lesson plan like I did, what Eda has in mind later on is teaching a set of vocabulary which is somehow academic vocabulary which connects to the issue of the environment. But the goal is a bit larger than that vocabulary. I really appreciate having these goals. This is what I typically do. So, going back to the chart, a very good place to manifest your goal is really the hook. So by hook, in lesson planning, we're talking about really a very powerful opening to the lesson where you can really attract the attention of the students. I believe that if you have a goal which is larger than grammar and vocabulary, already you have created a good hook. But I'd better just stop talking in abstracts and again share a couple of very good examples of how our teachers in this module created good hooks. So I'm gonna share two different approaches to creating hooks. The first one is from Elsie. So when describing the goal of the lesson or the vision of the lesson, Elsie involves the students in defining the lesson. Let's see what she does, then I'll talk a little bit more about this.
Okay, you guys, good morning. Today we are going to be working with adverbs. I left you guys homework for adverbs, right? So can you get your notebook out, please? Your homework that we had?
Yes, teacher.
Thank you.
One adverb.
And write.
So at this point, Elsie invites the students to come and define what an adverb is. So I think that's a pretty strong hook. I think that's respectful of the students that you already have some knowledge, but you give the ownership to the students to open the lesson. Watch.
Pass to the board and write their definition. I know that maybe you have a long one, so just shorten it out. Who wants to pass to write their definition? Okay. So Alexa, Israel, and then you give the marker to somebody else. Yeah.
So for me, that's a very strong example of a very good hook. So the students are involved from the very beginning. They define the topic. The hook could be something very simple, but again, as we talked about the goal, because it's about a serious sociocultural issue, a communicative situation, I think a student can put the students in a very good mood to follow the lesson. So let's look at how Eduardo opens the lesson with this communicative situation, creating that goal. Let's watch together.
Like Marissa has been talking about music. Okay, so let's talk about important life events. Okay. What are the important life events that we have, or that you have? Birthday.
Anniversary. Birthday.
Graduations.
Birthday.
Huh?
Birthday.
Birthday.
Birthday
Birthday every year.
Wedding.
Okay, so we have
New Year.
birth.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to stop it here. I'm going to get back to you. So again, a hook and goal, or the objective of the lesson, overlap most of the time. I think we have a good example of both here. So Eduardo has a broad topic, which is major life events. So what is the grammar he has in mind? You haven't read his lesson plan. I have. He's going to talk about the past tense. But he doesn't start with the past tense. He starts with what are major kind of life events? And people talk about birthdays, falling in love, getting married, finding a first job. These concepts can easily engage your students. So have a clear goal. The goal should be a bit broader than vocabulary and grammar. It should be a communicative event, a social event, a political issue. So then think of a strong hook. Involve the students in your lesson right from the very beginning and give them some voice. So if I go back to the chart, another major another major step for me in a lesson plan is the input. Now you have the students, what you have to do is really just send your message, tell them what the lesson is about. For instance, in Elsie's lesson plan, as we saw, she's inviting students to just go to the text. She explains, and after students share their own definitions, she provides a definition, and then she invites the students to find examples that illustrate that definition, examples of adverbs. So she has given the students enough input. I believe at some point in your lesson, you really need to have some time for engagement. I believe that, again, it might be because of my background, which is somehow task-based, so I'm interested in a task-based approach. I really enjoyed to see that a lot of you created some space for your students after input to engage with different tasks, with you keeping a little bit of distance, just appearing from time to time to facilitate those activities. I think this engagement part is a very, very important of the lesson. A lot of you have that, some of you had that, some of you didn't, but I would like to highlight it in this video and encourage you to create that space. So I have a couple of very good examples of how teachers in our module created the task and a space for students to engage with that task. I'm going to start with George. Let me just switch back to my file to find my George video. So I don't get into the details of the lesson plans. I just go to... So look at how George is inviting the students to engage in a conversation. If I remember correctly, I hope George is going to forgive me if I'm wrong, I think they're talking about the favorite job, something in those lines. But I really like, because you could do that in different ways. You could just stand in front of the classroom and ask the students to talk about their favorite jobs. But look at the way George uses a space and lets the students just engage with each other. I really love the way, let me just turn it down a little bit. I really love the way that the students are walking around the classroom. George has given them space to do that, to create a very genuine communicative situation. Okay, the next example I have is from Eder again, the environmental issue. Can I remember? At some point in his lesson, I think it should be at this minute 8 something. So, at some point in his lesson, he invites the students just to work on kind of group projects, engage with text, see what they can learn from those texts to address the environmental issues and what are the solutions. Obviously, to express solutions, they need the language to do that, and that means a lot of textual engagement. Look.
A little part, well, you're going to choose one problem, one environmental problem. Okay, and with that problem, I want you to create a little paragraph. Okay, I want you to write first. And then you're going to come to the front with all your... I'm going to tell you to work in groups, okay? And you're going to give a little presentation on how can you help Mexico with this. Any questions? No? No? Yes, many people don't have education.
Yeah, look at the way that the students are working in the groups. Eder appears as a facilitator, going to different groups.
Pronunciation? Which one?
This is really interesting. Here, Eda is addressing a pronunciation issue. Listen again.
I like everything. Any questions with the pronunciation? Which one?
Did you say? So that's really interesting. So Eda started with an environmental issue, or environmental issues and possible solutions, but now he's focusing on a pronunciation point. So this is what I meant by creating a kind of larger goal, but addressing kind of formalistic issues within that context. But again, don't be distracted from what we are focusing on. It's how the students are engaging with the text, and the teacher keeps a bit of distance, just facilitates. Let me go back.
Amount. Amount is the quantity.
Okay. And again, and the third example I have here is from Rowe. I really like the way Rowe invites the students, if I remember the details of the lesson plan correctly, in this lesson, the focus is communication, so the students eventually write emails or letters. So what Rowe does is invites the students to come to the board when it reaches the point of engagement in the lesson plan, and write down expressions that could be used in a message. So I really love the way the students engage with the idea. Let's go back.
Right? What's related to this one?
Sorry, I'm trying to... That's here. So the students will come in here, the teacher gives them a little bit of space. Look at the way the students are talking to each other. My motto is the best strategy in an English class is just letting students cheat. I think that's very communicative.
So all the words related to emails.
So I hope these examples have been useful. So let me go back to my chart for a second and finish this video. So have a clear goal. The goal should manifest itself in a very strong hook. If you want to lecture, if you want to share handouts, if you want to show a video, just do the input. But please create room for engagement. Let your students engage independently, preferably in conversation with one another rather than a conversation between the students and the teacher, and let them engage with the material freely. Of course, you're around, you're going to facilitate the conversation and engagement, and they're gonna learn from you if they need you, but create a bit of a space between you and the students. And don't forget that, I think a very successful lesson plan, from my point of view, again, this is my vision. Some people again like it, some may not. There should be a kind of output at the end of the lesson. So I'm not a huge fan of imagining that students can passively learn. I think receiving from teachers is okay, but in my classes, I always want to have a venue where students eventually share what they've done. So in Elsa's class with younger kids, it was the students are using adverbs in their own packages. And in other examples, for instance, in Rose's class, the students write those messages and share them hopefully in this class or later on. And in Eda's class, students present the solutions to the environmental issue. So a very, very short summary of kind of my thoughts about lesson planning. Lesson planning, I'm very passionate about lesson planning. So I encourage you to work a bit more on the lesson plans. I encourage you to take a look at the chart I created and see if there is something you like about it and you want to borrow. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be working with you. Muchas gracias. I'll keep in touch.